Jupiter is now stationary. It's been going backwards for quite some time, and this is as far back as it goes, and it's going forward from now on. And in this stationary position of any planet, there is a greater emphasis on the particular Sabian degree in which it is residing. I've recently talked a lot about Pisces 29, the prism, and I've given my own words on it. What I'd like to do today is to talk about the prism from the perspective of the originator of this work, Marc Edmund Jones. Pisces 29, a prism. This is a symbol of the world's stability and of the refusal of nature to change any aspect of herself unnecessarily. The reliability of normal processes and the consistency of true intelligence are the foundation of a common knowledge which man has been expanding through the centuries, and his continuance of the control he has gained over his environment is a promise of much more wonderful achievements ahead. He is able to take any convenient facet of the reality at his hand and fashion it into an effective instrument for a measure of the whole potential. The key word is validation. When positive, the key here, the degree, is exceptional accomplishment through judgment of unusual accuracy. When negative, fortuitous pride of intellect. It is understood within a prism that the white light, the source of creativity, God, separates into diversity of expression in the colours of the rainbow and so on through us in our different ways of expressing sacredness. And what we have here in Jones's take on it is really a particularity of that principle. The particularity being nature, what we see as what the world would be like were it not for human intervention. Nature. And how nature gets it right all of the time as a model for us to emulate. Nature's complexity and interrelatedness is perhaps the most amazing and beautiful thing that we will ever perceive. That the fact that there are so many species and the food of one is another's death. And you know, that interaction between life and death is creating this beautiful expression. There's a great deal of food for thought here. The idea that death is actually an aspect of beauty, and that it has to be that way for there to be balance in the dynamic sense. And our reworking of our ideas about death, and therefore about life, are inherent within that study of nature. But his point is basically that whatever we might want to be or do or so on has to be validated in nature. Nature validates things by giving it life and almost a seat at the table. You know, you're a component of nature if you're living well within it. And if you're not, then actually you die off. And this is true of the individual, and it's also true of our species. And I think this is a very poignant moment for us to contemplate that. If we can't actually tune in to what's going on with nature, then maybe the species is to die off. There's no reason to think that we should live as a species eternally, and if we don't get it right, we won't. Now, Rudhyar, in Pisces 29, speaks of the light breaking into many colours as it passes through a prism. The keynote is the analytical power of mind necessary for the formulation of life processes in their many aspects. Also thinking about the mind. Cycles of existence begin in unity and end in what I have called multi-unity. At the stage of consummation, the many individual differences are totaled. They constitute a sum. Within that sum, a unified total, the inevitability of the future processes of differentiation is implied, because every cycle leaves a mass of waste products slowly returning to the unconscious state of chemical matter, of humus. what the symbol tells us is that unity will always break again into multiplicity. The prism is always there. There is no absolute unity. If anything could be called absolute, it is the relationship between the one and the many. I think this is the key point. The relationship between the one and the many is that which Rudhyar is calling unity. Not the source and not the form, but the relationship between those two. That the source is creativity, birthing. And then nature applies to the differentiated aspect of self-expression and kills it off eventually, such that it can disintegrate and become the stuff of which creativity is once again given form. Very similar to Jones in that association with nature. And what does that mean in our life? Here we've got Jupiter stationary, so we now have to think about what Jupiter's doing within this whole idea of unity and diversity and the cycles of life and death and life and all of that. What's Jupiter doing there? Having been here once before, it's come back and had another look, and it's looking very, very carefully at this particular degree before it goes forward again and begins a new cycle. The first degree of Aries is soon to come, and so on. And we're off on this 12-year expression of Jupiter. And how do we apply this to our lives, our own personal circumstances? All of these concepts are all very well and good, but what does it matter to us in the material world? So Jupiter is saying, basically, you're alive, therefore you must grow. That's its essential message. Every living thing grows, and it grows either physically in the vegetable and animal kingdoms or in consciousness in terms of the human kingdom. So we're growing in consciousness because we're alive, Jupiter is saying. How do we do that? Where are our opportunities optimized for growth? And that Jupiter is currently deeply concentrating on this idea of the relationship between source and expression of source, is the clue, I think, that we have to know both as a dynamic movement. So we look towards God and then we look towards life in rhythmic repeatedness indefinitely. Jupiter's saying that's how to grow. That's life, therefore that's growth. And here's the clue to some of our projects and the kind of things that we focus on most of the time. We're all of us trying to achieve something. And yet, if we just go for it and we don't stop and consider the source of our creative urge in the first place, we're not going to get there. We're going to miss the point. We have to open up expansively and then remember the source of that expansion repeatedly in rhythm. This is the secret. So it's not so much work and rest as some of the other Sabian symbols indicate. This is to do with creativity and then inspiration, life expression and then death expression. So in your process of project development, shall we call it, you try something and then you just come back and you see whether or not that thing itself has life. Certain things only continue to exist because you're pushing them. You're re-energizing them again and again and again. And yet that's not real creativity. Real creativity is when you create something that is sustainable in itself, that no longer requires your supervision or your thrust. That's what real creativity is. And if your projects, by which I mean your marriage, your children, your everything, your work, everything, does not have that freedom of its own self-expression, then you're not replicating the fundamental formula of life, which is basically that there's the creator that lets its creation carry on to become, in turn, a creator itself. So we're not meant to look to God in order to do all of our creative work. Some people disagree with that, but it's really clear that we're given the power to create. Therefore, part of our way of being is to be creating. And we're not meant to stop doing that, except to relive the source of that, and then do some more, and then relive the source of that and do some more. But what we're creating is gifted with the same facility. So you have to set up all of your projects, like I say, your children and your relationship, to have its own creative sense of being. So there's a kind of warning here against over-controlling your output. If you allow nature to take its course, if you allow God to flow through you into your projects, they will gain a sacredness that you cannot control them to be. You can't make something sacred. You can set up the circumstances whereby your children become wonderful and your projects become wonderful expressions of yourself. You can set up the circumstances, but in the end, you have to allow sacredness to find its own way and to trust that that'll be okay. I think this is the fundamental meaning for us here. So while it's stationary, just for a few days, just renew your sense of awareness of why you're doing what you're doing. Why did you start this in the first place? Is it on track? Have a look again at the source of the inspiration of your creative urges. That's the mystery here, perhaps.